So today's reading is the final written account of the Pharisees and all the other religious leaders' attempt at trapping Jesus with their doctrinal test. We didn't cover all of these question times this year, but if you'd like to, you can read them one by one here at the end of Matthew. As you read them, maybe you're going to be like me, that it starts to feel like one of our present-day reality shows. Let's see if Jesus can sing a cappella. Or can you dance like us, Jesus? Or let's see if Jesus can cook with those ridiculous ingredients that you find on the show Chopped. The questions that they pose really have no right or wrong answer. And yet you can sense there's some tension building and intrigue. Jesus doesn't falter in any of his responses. Each time, Jesus manages to speak a word of truth without falling into their trap. Even so, they don't give up. There's one test after another. They seem desperate, don't they? And in my experience, people who use this type of trickery feel threatened. Perhaps the religious leaders sense their jobs are in jeopardy. Jesus, after all, has gathered a large following. And I half wonder if deep down they know that Jesus is the Messiah, and they are throwing every obstacle they can think of in his way in order to weaken his mission and his identity. It's like they know who they are dealing with, and they are agitated by the implications. And so in desperation, they throw out pop quizzes to see if he passes, if his followers will get tired of him. It's important for us to notice the way Jesus deals with this nonsense testing, and for us to see Jesus' response as a template for us to follow. Every time Jesus is confronted by his opposition, he responds in loving, kind ways. His answers are not what they expect, but ones that blow their minds. And it's good to note that Jesus doesn't try to engage in their scheme. He doesn't try to get them to like him or even to side with them to try to become buddies. He doesn't denigrate them. Rather, he speaks the truth in love. And in an indirect way, his answers hold them accountable for their actions and attitudes. This week's tricky test question comes immediately after the Sadducees took their turn at testing Jesus. And Jesus' response to the Sadducees left them speechless, kind of like a punch in the gut. And when the Pharisees heard about this, they stepped up their game. And they gathered a large group of religious leaders, religious lawyers, as they were called then, to go after Jesus one more time. Now, it was common exercise among the religious scholars, the religious lawyers in Jesus' day, to debate which of the 613 commandments in the law is the greatest. It was like a hobby, a game of the profession, something you would do around coffee. To the Pharisees, the greatest meant which one commandment sums up the essence of the whole or serves as a hub. Which commandment is at the center of all of the 613? Well, Jesus doesn't join them in a philosophical debate. Rather, he just matter-of-factly chooses the most common one, the Shema, a prayer straight from Deuteronomy 6:5, a commandment that was recited twice, if not 3 times a day, and was an integral part of their Sabbath liturgy. All faithful Jews would know this prayer. Children learned this prayer from the moment they were born. They would hear this prayer daily. The word Shema means listen. And so Deuteronomy 6:5 states, "Listen, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." It was a central commandment that reminded them of their covenant with God and God's covenant with them. Now, I'm not sure which commandment the Pharisees expected Jesus to choose. I imagine that they asked this question because they are interested to see if Jesus' knowledge and judgment met their high standards. Is Jesus more than just a popular, likable guy? And yes, we know he's a rabbi, but does he know the doctrine as well as we do? Jesus passes with this answer. He says, Deuteronomy 6:5 in this way, the Shema. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." But then Jesus adds another. He reaches into the third book of the Torah, the book of Leviticus, a commandment many viewed as a minor one of the 613. And Jesus says, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, now, they could have been scratching their lawyer heads and asking, why this one? As they would maybe chatter amongst themselves. And then, did you notice that this commandment is embedded in the commandment on how we are supposed to harvest our crops and our vineyards? This is the place where God directs the people of Israel to leave a portion of the harvest for the poor and the immigrant. The one that says, don't pick all your grain or pick your vineyards clean, leave some for the foreigners and the poor. Refrain from dishonesty. That whole section continues. Refrain from stealing and mistreating the disabled. Refrain from corruption, slander, and hatred. Don't take vengeance or bear a grudge. The context of this second commandment helped them and helps us today understand the sort of love Jesus is referencing. Greed has no place in God's understanding of love. Sharing and sacrifice, on the other hand, are one of the central aspects of love. Jesus continues in this portion of Matthew to build and create a vibrant, healthy communal life. Now, the irony here is that during the whole time of this, let's see if we can trick Jesus, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the other religious folks are doing anything but modeling obedience and love, the neighbor part of this commandment. They claimed that they followed every single one of the 613 laws. There's another interesting thing to note. Jesus changes the wording of the Shema, the wording of this Deuteronomy prayer. He changes the part that's all your might to all your mind. Perhaps it's a subtle dig at the way his opponents are using their intellectual gifts for treacherous purposes. And a warning for us to take care that we do not do the same. Are you loving God with all your mind? In addition, Jesus emphasizes or expands a common understanding of his people. His people, the lawyers, the religious folks, believe that loving God involves loving people. Jesus expands this to loving God and loving people and loving self as an interwoven experience. It's not separate. And another note that Jewish legal and exegetical teaching includes is the idea that the world hangs on the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But Jesus expands this when he says, on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Essentially, Jesus is saying the Torah itself hangs on extravagantly loving God, self, and neighbor. That loving God, self, and neighbor is the base, the foundation, the core. That love is the foundation of who we are and who we are to be. Now, love today is often portrayed as an emotional response over which we have no control. Like, oh, all of a sudden I just fell in love, right? I had this feeling. But here we see love as something that we make happen. It's a power verb, if you will. And yes, we all love it when the emotion of love comes upon us. And yet the command is to allow love to move from within us to others. It's an action that we participate in. And so this morning I invite you, as we follow Jesus' command to love our neighbor as ourselves and to love God with all our might and our mind and our soul, that we would pause and just think about ourselves. Think about yourself. How can you respect yourself? You might say, I want other people to respect me, but think, how can I respect myself? How can I appreciate myself? How can I choose to eat the foods that will help me to be healthy or to take care of me? What do I need today? And then to do the same for others. This love is community building at the greatest level. All the commandments rest or emanate from this love. And by combining these 2 commands, Jesus is saying how we best are to exist and function in this world. So I wonder, if someone came to you, and if you knew all the 613 commandments, and they said to you, choose the one that's the best. Today, in this modern age, we have stressed the 10, right? The 10 commandments. Many of us learned those 10 when we were younger. So maybe just look at those 10. Which of those 10 would you say was the most important? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand and tell me, but I'd be curious. You can tell me if you're interested. We all know what Jesus said now, so that kind of like throws it for us. Dr. Ralph Milton is one of my favorite lectionary commentators, and his wife is an ordained minister in British Columbia, where they reside. And Ralph brings humor to the way he opens up Scripture to the preachers. And as I was considering which commandment was the best, I came across this story and would like us to think about this. It's called How the Birds Formed a Church. A flock of birds decided to form a church. So they called a meeting, and the duck stood up and said, I think we should require baptism by immersion. It's the only way we can get their pocketbooks wet. This is Stewardship Month, right? But the rooster said, no, we should baptize by sprinkling. Many people dislike the embarrassment of getting wet all over. And so the argument went back and forth. Well, the parrot said, I don't think baptism is the most important thing. What we need is a good program. And all the birds cheered, for everyone knows that a church can't build a reputation for itself without a good program. And then the mockingbird said, "What about a choir? We must have a good choir. And don't forget, we need an organ." "Oh," said the thrush, "we don't want an organ. A piano is much better." But the cardinal didn't want any musical instruments at all, and the sparrows said, "I would just as well throw out all the music." And the goose stood up and said, "What we really need is a preacher who is good with young people. If you don't attract young people, the whole church will be gobbled up by them for sure. The other churches will gobble them up for sure." But the starling said he thought it was better that the preacher be a good mixer. And the blue jay figured if the minister could lay off preaching about sin and stuff that almost anyone would do, if the minister would lay off preaching about sin and that kind of stuff, then almost any preacher would do. "We just need a preacher who's popular among the townsfolk," he said. But the real disagreement came over the budget. Some thought that everyone should tithe if they could afford it, and others thought they should just do away with all the offerings and have faith. Well, finally, the owl rose and smoothed his feathers, and everyone grew quiet, for they knew that the owl had great wisdom. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "all these things are secondary. What we need is love." "Yes, sir," he said, quite pleased with himself. "Above everything else, we must all be loving, even if we don't mean it." So they formed a church, and it really was for the birds. Love is so simple. As a pastor, I have used that word so many times, so many Sundays, and yet I don't want to leave it, right? It is the core. It is something that we still need to learn to be more loving, right? As we allow this simple concept of love to expand and to move from our hearts and out into all that we say and do, oh, how amazing it would be. And if we would truly love and allow love to be our focus, the main ingredient of our lives, we would truly experience a beloved church, a beloved community, a beloved world. We would truly be transformed people. Amen? Amen.